Now, starting the webinar in 3, 2, 1, and go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special event. My name is Gina Matthews. I'm a professor of computer science at Clarkson University, and I'm going to pass the mic to Lorraine Kisselberg, who is going to open us up.
Good afternoon and evening, everyone. If you could, next slide. And welcome to the discussion of the documentary Code of Bias. We're happy you could join us today to discuss this phenomena of algorithmic bias and how we can move to futures of algorithmic fairness. My name is Lorraine Kisselberg. I'm chair of the Technology Policy Council for the Association of Computing Machinery, the oldest international society of computer scientists and professionals with over 100,000 members worldwide. We're proud to be one of the sponsors of this discussion, along with ACM's Diversity and Inclusion Council, Clarkson University, and with support from the National Science Foundation Advanced Grant Program. The Technology Policy Council and its committees include over 150 members who volunteer their expertise to develop reports, statements, and briefings around policy and the governance of technology. Essentially, our mission is to ensure that emerging technology policy is well-informed and grounded in scientific evidence and professional practice. Next slide, please. Our policy priorities focus on matters of cybersecurity, privacy, intellectual property, election security, digital governance, and artificial intelligence. This year, we have also turned to issues of AI bias, biometric data systems, climate change, and smart cities. But in the last few years, we have been especially engaged in discussions about artificial intelligence. For example, in 2017, we were one of the first to release a set of principles on algorithmic transparency and accountability. And the focus in this statement was on decision-making and concerns with fairness, accountability, and transparency, as well as related issues of bias, assessment, and explainability. The statement was intended to frame expectations in algorithmic design and development, as well as oversight and regulation. More recently this year, in response to growing concerns about facial recognition systems, especially those used for public surveillance, coupled with growing concerns about racial justice, we released another statement regarding facial recognition technologies, restating fundamental principles around privacy and security. But the focus of this statement is on biometric data protection and the potential bias and accuracy that have significant consequences for violation of human rights. Now, around the same time, in 2018, ACM revised its Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct to include new language reflecting broader responsibilities that we have as computing professionals, specifically including ethical principles to avoid harm, be fair, and contribute to society and to human well-being. So these issues surrounding ethics, bias, fairness, and justice in emerging technologies are important globally, but they also have particular importance to our own sense of duty and responsibility as computer professionals. Next slide, please. More recently, in 2019, ACM created the new Council for Diversity and Inclusion, which brings together a number of entities and activities. These include the Code of Ethics that I've just mentioned, overseen by the Committee on Professional Ethics, the ACMW Committee, which supports and advocates for women in computing internationally, as well as regional councils in Europe, India, and China that support communities beyond the US, along with other initiatives to further the commitment of ACM to diversity and inclusion. So that brings us to the context for today's discussion about algorithmic bias and fairness and the steps that we can take to ensure that through our technologies, our practice, our communities, and our governance, we are working together to ensure our societies reflect global diversity, that they are inclusive and they contribute to human well-being. So before I introduce the panelists, I want to acknowledge the support of the people who have made this event possible. In addition to our sponsors, I want to thank Paul Harland and Gina Matthews, who you just heard a few minutes ago, who are members of the U.S. Tech Policy Committee, and Gina is also a member of our ACM Technology Policy Council. They initiated the suggestion and planning for this screening and discussion. And so we joined with efforts that Professor Matthews had created for her campus at Clarkson University, where they hosted multiple forums and discussion celebrating Women's History Month. I also want to thank John West and Natalie and Wright Jurger, who are co-chairs of the Diversity and Inclusion Council that I just mentioned, who's co-sponsored this event, and they've initiated a number of new activities around diversity in the last 2 years of this inaugural council. I also want to thank Adam Eisgrau and Bruce Shriver and the rest of ACM staff who have provided the necessary support to organize and promote this event broadly so that more people could be engaged in the conversation. And I also want to applaud the work of the filmmaker, Shalina Kataya, for a film that provides a tremendous service in raising awareness about important issues. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So next, I want to turn to our distinguished panelist and moderator for today's discussion. I'm delighted to have the chance to bring together these distinguished voices in the fields of AI, algorithms, law, and social justice. They are trailblazers, including one of the first female professors of engineering at her university, the first African-American woman to serve as a judge in the state of Tennessee, the first Black female to receive a PhD in computer science from MIT. But importantly, they have all distinguished themselves in their own fields. In addition, each have devoted significant parts of their professional lives to improving their profession by leading their organizations and contributing to policy development, educational innovations, and initiatives that have a lasting impact. They also represent our global face as contributing members of our committees and councils from the US, Europe, and Latin America. And so we're honored to have them with us today. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each one of these individuals. First, Dame Wendy Hall was the Associate Vice President Regius, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Southampton, and also the Executive Director of the Web Science Institute, which she co-founded in 2006 with Sir Tim Berners-Lee. She's also the newly appointed chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Among many honors that she has received, she is a fellow of the British Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, an ACM fellow, and she has been a member of a number of national councils in the UK for science and technology and for artificial intelligence. She's past president of ACM, a member of Europe's Tech Policy Committee, and she's led many activities, including currently being chair for the Informatics for All Committee in Europe. Next, we have the Honorable Bernice Donald, who is a federal judge on the US State Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and is a leading figure of American law. She is the first African-American woman to serve as a judge in the state of Tennessee. She was a district court judge for 15 years and has served on the Court of Appeals for 10 years. She's a member of the American Law Institute and a leader in the American Bar Association, where she chaired the Center for Human Rights and also authored a resource book for judges and practitioners titled Enhancing Justice, Reducing Bias. We also have with us here Professor Latanya Sweeney, who is the Daniel Paul Professor of Government and Technology at Harvard University, where she also directs the Data Privacy Lab and is one of the pioneers in the emerging field of algorithmic fairness. Professor Sweeney was the first Black woman to earn a PhD in computer science from MIT. She served previously as Chief Technology Officer of the US Federal Trade Commission, and she's a member of ACM's Technology Policy Council. We also have Professor Ricardo Baeza-Yates, who is a research professor at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University, and a member of the Web Science and Social Computing Group at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. You will have to excuse my horrible Spanish, in Barcelona, Spain. Professor Baeza-Yates previously served as Vice President for Research at Yahoo Labs for 10 years and was also a professor at the University of Chile. He is an ACM Fellow, an IEEE Fellow, and author of the book Modern Information Retrieval, and currently a member of the US Technology Policy Committee. Finally, our moderator, Professor Gina Matthews, is a professor of computer science at Clarkson University She's an affiliate of the Data and Society Center. She has been a Fulbright specialist, and her work focuses on virtualization, security, and individual rights in automated systems. She was one of the lead authors of the 2017 Statement on Algorithmic Transparency that I mentioned. She's a member of ACM's Technology Policy Council, as well as the ACM Council, and she previously chaired the SIG Governing Board of ACM. So what a dynamite panel. And I'm very, very excited to hear all of these people speak. So many thanks to these panelists and also to you as an audience for joining us. I very much look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Judge Donald, I believe you are going to lead us off, yes?
Absolutely. Let me, first of all, Dr. Matthews, thank you and the entire group who put this on for inviting me into the world of coded bias and into the world of the the Association for Computing Machinery. I feel slightly out of place, but then people who are in my position probably make up the bulk of those who are affected by the world in which we now live. And when I say that, I mean people who really don't know about the science behind it, but are avid consumers and people affected as users in the world. I want to make just a couple of comments to frame the issue from the perspective of those who are not computing professionals. As you know, the world stands at a pivotal moment for individual rights and for multilateralism. As I think about where I am today and I look back over my professional career, we have been affected and continue to be affected by the trajectory of technology. And thinking about this, I think about how the voices globally and around the world are being amplified through the technologies that you will talk about today. And those technologies affect us in myriad ways. And there are themes that Lorraine touched on in her introductory remarks. They are themes that resound in democracy, in dignity, in human rights, in justice, and in the rule of law. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about how coded bias and emergent technologies relate to the new area of law burgeoning around the globe, including the United States, and that is dignity rights law. Dignity rights is recognized in nearly every constitution. It's found in the international human rights treaties and domestic laws. And I will explore a little bit how this relates, in my view, to AI ethics and governance. In reflecting on what I might say to you today, I went back over my own life and my journey to the law and ultimately to the bench. First of all, growing up in the South in a completely segregated society, I firmly believe that there is no place for racial or gender discrimination or discrimination on any of the artificial characteristics of birth in our society in any form or space. And that includes online, offline, or any other way arising from the uses of these powerful new technologies like artificial intelligence. Yet we know that is a risk. We've seen the evils and atrocities of explicit and legally sanctioned discrimination, systematically depriving individuals of their dignity and of their individual rights, undermining societies, leading to conflicts, and eroding the foundations for peaceful, stable, and democratic societies. We've seen this in both explicit and implicit discrimination and biases and the harm they cause. They have marginalized individuals and imposed barriers that needlessly exist. And these have fallen disproportionately on people of color, people with disabilities, on poor people, indigenous people, migrants, and refugees. And if we think about the situation that we hopefully are emerging from, the recent pandemic, we can see again how the digital divide has adversely affected people. We know that people who are in poor communities and marginalized communities and communities of color are less likely to be technologically proficient or have access to the vast technologies that many of us take for granted. And yet in those same communities where people desperately needed to make appointments for COVID tests or for COVID vaccines, many of those individuals were stymied because they did not have access to the technology. But that doesn't just affect those communities, it affects all of us. And so we recognize also that in the throes of people having to be educated at home, many of those communities lack the technology to be able to access the internet and other types of technology to allow them to stay on pace with people who are in more affluent societies. And what about individuals who are elderly or individuals who are in those same communities when doctors' offices were no longer taking in-person appointments and they were encouraging people to engage in telemedicine? It is difficult for one without access to get the benefits of medicine from a doctor via technology. So this has opened up to us and shown a bright light on how important it is that in fashioning technologies and moving ahead, that we leave no individuals behind. We as a nation, we as a society, have to recognize that we cannot afford to leave people totally left out, because the world right now demands access and inclusion in the technological arena and with all of these other things. But that's not the only reason that I bring this up. I want to make an important point about law and justice. Lorraine mentioned that I'm a judge. I'm actually in my 4th judicial position. I started my position in a high volume criminal court, a court that dealt with people charged with misdemeanors and felony preliminaries, a court that was high volume, a court that had lots of people in it who were poor and who could not afford to make bail, even though they might have been charged with an offense that only required $250 or even $100 to make bail to be able to be released back into their community. These people are ultimately vulnerable. And I know that we're looking now, and courts are looking at technologies to decide, that are using rather predictive algorithms to decide who is dangerous, who is likely to appear, who has the risk of recidivism. And I think those who are in the computing industry have to be very sensitive to how technologies are used, and be able to sound a caution to those who will be consuming those technologies. If technology and algorithms simply look backwards and encode past data, they are likely to perpetuate past harms. So I think that we have to have a broader scope and factor in data that perhaps we don't readily think about when we're designing things. And I know if you look at some of the cases, courts have said, well, courts should not use a sole machine and relegate all the discretion there. They should use other tools. But there is a human tendency, I think, in many instances to default to the neutral technology. But is technology really neutral? And your code of ethics countenance you to look ethically at what you're doing and to take into account all of those factors that you are fully aware of. And I would encourage you to give particular attention to those factors. You know, there have been situations in my line of work, and I have to admit that when I was on the district court and when I was on the lower level high volume court, we were not using these technologies, but I do know that they are vastly being used now. So as a judge, there were still formulas that we use to make those determinations. But it is so easy to replicate and perpetuate past harms, because those individuals who have been subject to that are the ones that are least likely to have a voice, least likely to have resources, and least likely to have the kind of stature that would create those second and third looks. Indeed, those individuals, as we saw in the film, are often the victims of this coded bias because there is no seat at the table. So you have to, in your work, expand the lens, the spotlight on that work to take into account myriad strands of data, myriad viewpoints that will allow you to design the best products that you can to ensure justice, to ensure fairness, and to ensure conclusion. I love the technologies that are at my disposal now. It is a world that I could not have dreamed of when I was a young lawyer. And I have benefited enormously from this technology. The fact that I'm able to sit here today and be on a panel with these incredible giants in the computing industry. The fact that I am able to have conversations with Lorraine, that I am able to be included in the orbit of Dr. Matthews. The fact that I will get to know Dr. Sweeney and others, it's just really fabulous. But when I go back to the work that I do and I'm fashioning opinions and I'm looking at what courts have done and when I'm looking at the people who come before me, I can't just default to the algorithm. I have got to have a larger scope because in the final analysis, AI in itself doesn't have an ethical compass. It borrows its legitimacy from the ethics of the profession and from the ethics of those who are designing the programs. And we know based on your compass that it must comport with the principle of liberty which says that uses of AI must be lawful and that public trust will hinge then on compliance with those technologies, and that civil liberties and civil rights will always be at the core. So we have the ability through the use of AI premised on dignity and on ethics to create a system that really does take into account the welfare and the good and the just for all people. The question is whether we have the will and the commitment to do that. And it is my hope today that those of you who really are the captains, the brains, the engines, the architects of our future will agree with me that we must in fact design technologies that really work for the good and for the advancement of a more fair and more just society. And I am enough of an optimist to believe that that is exactly what you will do. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge Donald. May we live up to that call. Professor Hall?
Thank you. Oh, well, I mean, you're saying you're not a computer scientist, Judge Donald, but I mean, it's hard. You're a hard act to follow. But I'll try. So I'm not gonna. So basically, just to tell you a bit more about me and where I'm coming from on this panel, I've been a professor. Well, I've been at the University of Southampton a long time, and I go back. My PhD was in pure mathematics in the 70s. But when I went into computing, moved into computing in the 1980s, which was the time of the personal computers, and you know, I was putting video on computers, which in those days was like science fiction. And today we have these things, we carry them around in our pockets, and quite amazing what I've seen in my lifetime. But I started out actually in AI, and I was, but in those days, in the 80s, AI was very much the realm of philosophy. It was coming out of philosophy, and Alan Turing and the you know, the idea of can machines think like human beings, and so it was quite a different, and when I started in it, it was rule based and it was expert systems. Just, I mean, they were just beginning, and the idea of face recognition was really, it was an idea that in those days, we really thought it was not a problem you could possibly solve in the general case. But this is before the idea of training on data really emerged. And so image processing was unbelievably, and speech processing in their infancy. And this was a world of science fiction, very much so, you know, 2001 and all that sort of the movies that were coming out then. And so I think we have to set what we're doing in that context. In that way, AI sort of crept up on us. Because people talked about the ethics of AI way back, because it came out of philosophy. That was when they were talking about, could a machine think like a human being? And of course, if we are actually still nowhere near that, absolutely nowhere near that. But we, you know, it's very debatable whether we'll get there. The singularity, it is something philosophers still debate, as do computer scientists. And but I think that I'm sort of in Stephen Hawking's camp. One of the last things he talked about before he died was the idea that if you could get artificial general intelligence, that would be the end of the human race, right? That was his argument, that machines would out-evolve the biological creatures that we are, if you could get to that point. But the question is still debatable, but I think if we're thinking in that way at all, then we have to prepare the ground now for what we're trying to do with this, because the genie is out of the bottle. Because what's happened in the last 30 years since I became a professor is a lot more compute power and a lot more data, so that the bright ideas that people like Geoffrey Hinton and co had in the 80s about these things called neural networks that would, work a bit more like the brain does, and then putting that together with the machine learning ideas and having the concept of training training machines to learn from data, however you do that, has become feasible today in a way that we, hardly dreamt would be possible. And here we are in this world, and it's sort of crept up on us. And although we've talked about this stuff for 50 years, here we are today with machines that can do the most amazing things, and we don't know how to manage them. We're in a sort of a catch-up world, and that's what I'm looking forward to discussing a bit today. Is it possible, right, to understand how, to actually regulate this space? How do we do it in a way that's practical, workable, and fair to everybody, as the judge was talking about, which is an undeniable right. But we're living in a world where we've created something knowingly that doesn't give people those rights. Okay, and as you said, it's building on unbiases that are in society, and so I think we have major issues to think about. So I got involved in this world quite recently with co-wrote the AI review for the UK government in 2017. We raised these issues. As part of that, the government in the UK set up the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And that's being reviewed now as to what it does. We have an Office for Artificial Intelligence and AI Council that I sit on to advise the government. I'm a skills champion. And most recently, I was lucky enough and a huge honour to chair the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is independent of government. It's funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And one of its main research themes is algorithm accountability. And Lorraine, you were talking about evidence-based work. Well, that's what Ada does. It collects evidence to show that, and it's looking very pragmatically at how we can help organizations, governments, people find their rights and to develop algorithms in an accountable way. How do we regulate? I think this is, and we can come back later to talk about how it's working around the world and so on. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I am going to finish this bit with something I am absolutely passionate about, which is diversity. And I include women in that, right? I know we need, it's got to be but we can't, I mean, as a bra-burning feminist from the 60s, we still don't have enough women in technology. In fact, there was a report came out from the Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for AI in the UK, just last week about the gender gap in AI skills. It's called Where Are the Women? It echoes a paper I wrote in 1987 called Where Have All the Girls Gone? And it says the situation is worse than we thought, right? The number of women working in AI, in the technical side of AI, is tiny. And that, you know, then you look at all the other diversity types that you want to bring into this debate. And my mantra, and is in the UK, and I want to get a t-shirt made, is if it's not diverse, it's not ethical. Because companies that are developing material where there is no, I mean, you just look at the companies where there is no diversity in the team, some of the big ones, even huge ones, in the technical teams. So if, you know, it's much more likely for bias to creep in. Diversity doesn't stop bias creeping in. We're all biased, but my starting point is, if you haven't got diversity, you're much more likely to end up with biased systems. So I will stop there for now. We can come back later when you ask us questions, Jeanna.
Thank you so much, Professor Hall. I want one of those t-shirts. It's not diverse, it's not ethical. That's awesome. Professor Baeza-Yates, can we pass the mic to you?
Yeah, thank you, Gina, and thank you, Lorraine, and all the people here. I'm a bit intimidated, the truth. It's like representing a lot of people here. But mainly, I would say developing countries. So I was born in Chile, so I come from Latin America. And I have lived also in Spain, Australia, New Zealand. So I think I have a world view, and also participating because of my interest in bias in the Spanish Council of AI in Spain, initiative of the Inter-American Development Bank to have fair algorithms in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also recently we started the NGO in Chile to basically do the same things that the Algorithm Watch does in Europe, to watch how algorithms are used in the Chilean society. And something similar has started like 1 year ago in Spain. I would like to start with that, because I think one important problem here in bias are the cultural differences. So what is biased in one place may not be biased in another, because of your culture, religion, even is encoded in language. For example, I always say in Spanish, we don't have a single word for accountability. You can guess what is the reason, but that's not my field. And then because of that, many times we are not aware of bias. So the first problem in bias is awareness. And for example, I should apologize right away if, for example, I'm not aware of things I say, that I'm still biased, because no one has told me that I have an issue with that. So if someone doesn't told you, it's very hard to know that you are biased, because you grew up listening to your family saying that, and you think it's fine, but no, it's not fine, or shouldn't be fine. So these things are changing in time. And bias can be much more subtle than the main focus of the movie, the coded bias. So yes, we have gender bias, we have race bias. In many developing countries, we have class bias, and so on. But for example, first thing that even some Turing Awards get it wrong is that bias is not only in data. So bias may come from algorithms, and also it's something I'm working on, also comes a lot from the feedback loop that we have between users and machines. So basically how we use the systems, and only if we're recommended only 4 things, of course, we have exposure bias, and then the algorithm itself is writing the future of that interaction data, because I'm only clicking 4 things. I'm only clicking 4 things. So this is very important. Bias is much more complicated. Now also, bias can be so subtle that a priori we cannot measure it. And I like this, the recent case in Bologna with a delivery platform, basically a food delivery like Uber Eats, that was doing indirect bias against people that couldn't deliver at dinner time. You cannot guess that from the beginning, that you have to check for that in the data, right? And also it's historical data that is changing dynamically with the interaction with the system. But people that wanted to have a normal dinner with their kids or dependent people, they didn't leave it at that time, and then they got discriminated by the platform. And I think it's a landmark case mentioned for the judge that shows that we should look at these problems that are sometimes much more subtle. Another topic that I think is very important, that is we should touch here is what is called physiognomy, or more people will call it phrenology, basically using facial biometrics to infer your personality. Or some, for example, coming from Stanford, sexual preferences or political affiliation, or something coming from MIT, give me your voice, I will give you your face, or something coming from another university that I will tell you if you are a criminal. And it's nice that Judge Donald mentioned that, and like Minority Report is wrong. So not only have people trying to do these things and trying to prove that they could be a danger, but also showing it, because other people that don't agree with that will use it anyway, is that they're coming from top universities and then they're published in top journals like Nature. So who is stopping the ethics there? The IRBs are not doing it, publishers are not doing it, and we are citing them, we are not doing it. So please, even if we can do it, even if we can show that can be done, in some cases, don't do it. And we need, I think that's something important we need to learn. Many people don't know that a lot of people is doing research since 2016, at least in this field. Sadly, maybe the public doesn't know that. My first paper on bias was in 2008, but I didn't know that I was doing a paper on bias. I realized that after. I was worried about the problem, and then I realized, well, I have been working more than 12 years on bias, but I was not aware of that. Even you are not aware of what you are doing. And Jeanna said we should mention something different that we should be proud of. And I think what I'm proud of is that all my first PhD students were male, as the norm almost in computer science. But I did something about it. And now of my 31 graduate PhD students, 15 are female. And next year will be 12. So 50% of my PhD students will be female. So that's my contribution, at least to computer science, to fix a little bit the gender bias problem.
Thank you so much. To finish this wonderful tour of our panelists, may I pass the mic to the wonderful Professor Sweeney.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And I thank you, Lorraine, as well, for your leadership, and you've done a fantastic job with the policy committee. You know, it's really great to be the last person because everyone has sort of laid the groundwork for all of the pieces, and allows me to come and try to put a capstone on it to lead us into question and answering. And I would start with the points that Judge Donald gave us. And those points had to do with the nature of technology design. You know, technology design really is the new policymaker. We don't elect them, we don't vote for them, but the decisions that they make, and arbitrary decisions in design, dictate the rules that we live by. And they're not necessarily thinking about those rules. Like, I'm reminded when, you know, I'm old enough, if you look at my gray hair, that when I was in computer science, when I started in computer science, I should say, I still am in it, but when I started in computer science, all I wanted to do was build a thinking machine. From my earliest age, it's all I wanted to do is build a machine that could be like a human. And I was running on my way with it as a graduate student. And we all believed that the future of technology was to save and fix the ills of our society. And we felt that quite passionately. One day I run across an ethicist, and I heard her say computers are evil. So I stopped and said, well, let me correct her thinking. Doesn't she understand the beautiful power of what the future would be? And she literally foretold the future. She talked about how our social contracts were going to be broken by the way, at that time, data was being shared. I was so convinced I could change her thinking that I started to do an experiment. And of course, that experiment showed the opposite. It was showing how a public release of medical data that included the governor of Massachusetts information, how easy it was for me to re-identify him with other publicly available data that was also made available, because our access to inexpensive disk storage just made it so much easier to share data, and our society wasn't prepared for how these data sets could be combined and the consequences it would have. And that was to be a life-turning moment for me, because literally within a month as a graduate student, I did this experiment to re-identify Governor Wells' medical record. And the next month, I'm testifying in DC, because there wasn't just that one data set, that was the practice around the world. And within the year, regulations around the world changed, sort of pioneered the field of data privacy. It was an unbelievable moment. A few years ago, we revisited and began looking at publicly available data, and it showed vulnerabilities. But now we see a rigidity to change. The same kind of aha moment didn't really take hold. Part of that is because there's just so much money now in data. There's so many products that rely on the vulnerability of these data sets that it now makes our society much more resistant to change. What I was able to learn, though, was that privacy was sort of the first wave. When I became a professor at Harvard, I was into the position about a month in my new office when I was being interviewed by a reporter, Adam Tanner. And he wanted me to show him a particular article. And so I typed my name into the Google search bar and I say, hey, there's the link that we're looking for. And he says, forget that link. Tell me about the time you were arrested. I said, well, I've never been arrested. He says, then why does the computer say you've been? And sure enough, there was this ad that said Latanya Sweeney arrested. I go back and forth with him about how I've never been arrested. I end up clicking the link. I pay $89 for an annual subscription to this company to show that they not only didn't have an arrest record for me in their database, they didn't have an arrest record for anyone named Latanya Sweeney in their database. And he and I began for a couple of hours playing around with what would make a neutral ad and what would make an arrest ad come up. And we learned right away you had to have a full name, a first and last name. It had to be a real person. And Adam says, oh, I get it. It's because you got one of those black sounding first names. And I look at Adam, I said, what do you know about a black sounding first name? Except I type my name into the Google image search and up pops a screen full of Black women. I type Tanya into the image search and up pops a screen of white women. And we realized that there really are names given more often to Black babies than white babies and vice versa. And that this appearance of these ads was somehow related to the appearance to those names. After 132,000 lookups through a VPNs, because at that point I was determined to find the answer, what was going on. It was the first time that we were able to make the case of algorithmic bias and to show that this system, which is Google Ad Network, was demonstrating this bias. And it was exactly as Ricardo just said. There are two answers for that. Part of it is, was there bias in the setup, bias in the ads that the company said that it wanted run by Google? And to some extent, there's evidence for that. But there's also this issue of how many times people were more likely to click if the name was given more often to Blacks than whites. And there's some evidence of that. That is the feedback loop of the user. Either way, it didn't really matter. You know, discrimination's not illegal in the United States, but some people are protected at certain times. So if one of those groups is Blacks and one of those situations is employment. And if two people are going for a job and the employer types their name into the search bar and one comes up implying they have an arrest record, even if they don't, there's a disparate impact. And I was able to show that it's actually statistically significant, an 80-20 split. And it became the first time that we could say an algorithm violated the Civil Rights Act. What's interesting about that experiment, now we fast forward, not only do we look at the work, of course, of Joy Bawani in this movie, but also the other experiments that we've seen. There's just been a huge body of examples where of algorithms that we use. For example, job recommendation algorithms can easily encode in them bias towards youth, where the employer says, I only am interested in these resumes, only send me more people like that. And that may be only people who are young. And a violation of the Equal Employment Act, right? We've seen credit violations that are the panel has already talked about recidivism algorithms and, of course, the issues of face recognition. I bring this up because in the example that happened first with those ads, we know that happened and bared witness to it because of a scientific study that says, hey, this is really happening and it's happening in large, because there was someone who could actually test it. But increasingly, many of these algorithms are in a situation where we can not only not see the algorithm because the company says it's proprietary, not view the training data because a company says it belongs to someone else and they hold the rights to it, and not even be able to inspect the output that's in a closed loop with the user, like in the employment example. This lack of transparency and lack of accountability makes it impossible for us to actually enforce the laws and protections and historical protections, I should say, that people have fought very hard for. And as a result, the decisions that are being made and trapped in these algorithms determine how those rules really are. They're reauthorizing those laws. I very much advocate for more transparency and more accountability. You know, President Macron in France says, look, algorithms should be public and should be open and the data should be public, meaning that anytime major decision-making is happening in France, he believes that those algorithms should be able to be inspected and the data sets on which they're trained or can be evaluated should be made public. I think this kind of idea is extremely important for us in order to protect our historical protections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sweeney. And thank you to all of the panelists for that amazing set of thoughts to kick us off. We could really maybe end here, but no, I'm not gonna, because I'm gonna take my shot of asking you all some questions. The first question I would like to ask you all is, I think a lot of people think of artificial intelligence as the future, very futuristic. And, you know, artificial intelligence also uses past data to predict the future in a way that could be viewed fundamentally as very conservative, as enforcing or encoding the status quo. I'm curious what you all think. How do you think of AI? As futuristic technology or as enforcing the past? And what role do you see AI playing in our collective future? Or what role would you want it to play? Who'd like to start?
Well, I'll jump up on part of it because I know my colleagues here are anxious to jump in on the other parts, but I'll take the low-hanging fruit, and that is the thing that drove me when I was a graduate student at MIT, and that continues to drive me today, is the belief that I want society to enjoy the benefits of technology without these harms. Finding these sweet spots and getting rid of this idea that there has to be a zero-sum conflict, which is totally a false belief, is really to me, is the real goal. How do we enjoy all of these benefits with protections?
So, you know, to your first question, I think the answer is both. I think that it will encode past data and make predictions based on that. But I think it also, in some instances, will be future looking or futuristics, because I think it will look at problems and try to design solutions to those problems, and will not be able to solely rely on past data. But I think obviously past data will be a part of the database on which that will be used. And there are problems that AI will solve. And when I talk about AI and machine computing, I'm looking at not just the AI and those algorithms, but a whole range of things. And when I think about some of the incredible technology that is at use right now for good, I think about what I have seen on TV that people have been able to do with technology in terms of searching in disaster areas and provision of certain things. I think about some of the good things that have come out of what probably to you is old technology, but for me it's fairly new, the drone technology and things that they've been able to do. So I think a lot of good will come out of this, and much of it will be future looking. But you know, knowledge is basically incremental. So we're always sort of building, but because we are building on past data, doesn't mean that we can't refocus and that we can't also chart new territories as we learn proficiencies from past things. So that would be how I would, what would support my answer, that it's both.
So let me go next then. Let me answer the futuristic part, because I think it's clear that data encodes the past, and if we use it to predict the future, we'll just keep the past. And this is happening in, for example, in the examples of the movie. So the futuristic part for me will be to use AI to solve the problems we're talking about. And I have mentioned this in more in Spanish than in English, but for example, I would love to have like a little conscious assistant that is my personal assistant. I think Harari also mentioned this. Mentioned this in one of his interviews. So it's something that it's a natural idea. Is that will tell me every day, will report to me. So basically, two things I would like me to report. Your biased behavior. So basically, it will tell me what I have done wrong during the day. And of course, many people will not like to use this, but I think part of the problem is to have the will to use technology to improve yourself. And the second thing, it will be that also will tell me all the people that try to manipulate me in many different ways, through internet, in a conversation, through an email, and basically be aware, saying at least be aware, consider all these things, and I will take the decision in mind. And now I remember something that the judge said that is very important when we use technology, and this is also very old. The problem that using technology to support any decision, for example, a justice decision, is that there are works that show that people is biased to those decisions. So for example, I think there was a very important in Philadelphia in the 90s, they were using an expert system, a rule-based system, to help judges, and they found out that basically judges tend to accept that the proposed decision and use that decision. And they did a comparison with judges that were using the system and not using the system. So that's another problem. When we use technology, we kind of like it and accept it. And for example, I guess fake news is another facet of that I will not touch. But this is also the danger, that we believe too much in technology. For example, Latanya was talking about search. Well, all people click more in the first result because it's the first result. And that's called ranking bias. And we, in search engines, and I worked at that time at Yahoo, and Yahoo is the only one that has 3 published papers on how to solve that problem, basically how to debias top clicks, because they are click more only because of their position, not because of their quality. So all these things are important. Again, I will stress the importance of the relevant feedback loop, that if we are not aware of that, we are fooling ourselves when we are building that technology.
Are you waiting for me?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Well,
if you'd like to share some.
I don't have much to add to all that. I think the judge, I would say the same. Your answer is the same. I mean, it's both, right? It's but there's no doubt AI is here and with us now, and things are, you know, I think we are I think, as I said earlier, we're in a position where the technology is outpacing our ability to regulate it. And so we have to think about that. So Latanya, who quoted Macron, who's not my favorite person at the moment, I have to say, for COVID reasons. But you know, the idea that we make everything public, I think that doesn't work. I mean, if you take the analogy of where we are with financial regulation, you have a system of audits and declarations by companies that such and such is what they've done with the money, and they're not being corrupt, they're not breaking the law, and this is, you know, that, and you have an auditing system. And I think we will develop an auditing system, and this is where the courts will come in, judge, because you know, it's regulating the regulators, and what we do with people, how we hold them to account when they've broken the law. These are things we have to work out. But if we make it too heavy-handed, then and I would liken it a little bit to GDPR in Europe, where, you know, the ideas are absolutely laudable, but the way they brought it in, the bureaucracy is so high, the levels of bureaucracy are so high, it makes it very difficult for people to innovate and for small companies to adopt it. But I think developing a globally recognized, maybe, or certainly nationally, and then global agreements, auditing system, looking at, I mean, there's the bias at data level, right, which is where you were going in terms of past data. Then there's the bias at the algorithmic level, and then there's the, you know, the fact that you cannot, with the new sort of deep learning algorithms, you can't reverse engineer how decisions have been made, and so you know, you have to test it in other ways to make sure it's fair. And a lot of the, you know, so, but we are living in a world where AI is everywhere, and there's a lot more to come.
Absolutely. And, you know, I said, and I may have been seen as protesting the use of artificial intelligence in courts. What I'm really concerned about is the danger of people defaulting to the algorithm and abdicating judicial responsibility for decision making. It can't just be a single factor. It's got to be the judge and all of the other agencies doing their job and placing appropriate emphasis. And I do mean appropriate, but also the individuals who are doing that have to do this self-audit and be aware, as Ricardo said, they've got to be aware of their own potential biases, because you see, you can have bias on bias, but I think awareness, as one of our questioners said, is important. But then what do we do with that awareness? Do we simply excuse by saying, oh, not me, the algorithm did it? Well, that's not good enough, because that can promote injustice. But if we use these tools appropriately and understand a broader range of factors, and then apply unbiased or neutral judgments to that, hopefully we can get closer to a fair outcome.
Thank you all so much for engaging on that range of issues and questions. I think it sounds like we all have a hope for a future in which we can get the best of both worlds of automated decision-making and human decision-making, and not the worst of those both worlds. But I think you're hearing all of our panelists say that it's not automatic. We're going to need to do a lot of work to bend it to our will and have it not just changing under the hood the way we make societal decision-making without even discussion. So a very sobering, if somewhat hopeful look. Okay, here's my next question. It is sometimes said, and I think it was said in Coded Bias, that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Sometimes when people say that, what they mean is privileged folks get the toys or the advanced technology, and eventually everyone else will get it too. But here, it means that surveillance and manipulation tech is coming first to marginalized groups. That privileged folks can buy themselves some more privacy, or can buy themselves another second look at a decision about them from a human being or an advocate, and not everyone can. I'm curious what you think this says about the future for all of us. You know, is what's happening to marginalized groups the canary in the coal mine? And more specifically, we have very different competing visions of the future being put forward. In Europe with the GDPR, in the US with let private companies do it, in China with social credit score, and many other places, charting a vision of the future. How do you see these different views of interaction of technology and policy? And what does that say about the future for all of us? Who'd be willing to start that one off?
Well, I don't mind. I've just written a book about it.
Yay.
Yay. It's due out in June, and it's called For Internets. And so why is what you asked there resonates with me, and I've got to be very careful here to keep my comments short and pithy. We talk about internet governance in the book, and to me, this whole internet governance, data governance are very intertwined. And then AI, of course, is built on data at the moment. So these things are inextricably linked. And in the book, we pick up on, well, your comments there, Gina, we have an open internet. We are all talking today because there's still a universal open free internet that nobody owns and nobody governs as such. But it stayed up and was resilient in COVID, right? We all went onto the internet as in one, foul swoop, and the internet stayed up. Huge tribute to the pioneers that built it. But we all know the things that are the way that the internet is evolving is very different in different areas of the world. And as you said, Jeanna, this is why we talk about 4 internets. You've got the open universal, technical universal open standards, but you have the market force-led internet and data governance in the US. You have data protection-led data protection-led governance in Europe. And you have the surveillance society, social credit system society in China. And then there are lots of other players as well. We have a chapter in the book about India, as we call India the swing state. And one of the reasons we do that is because, and I think this is very important where we're going in terms of bias, and what you're talking about is underrepresented groups, because you can, if you think globally, we reached the 50% point about 2 years ago, when 50% of the world, it was estimated, has access to the internet. If assuming you could afford it, you had access, you can have access to the internet, about 50% of the world. Now that means, that's awesome. We've done that in about 30 years, but that means there's 50% of the planet still to come onto the internet. And that 50% of the planet is largely in rural China, rural India, and rural Africa. And some in South America as well. It's a patchwork quilt in South America. And I defer to Ricardo's knowledge of South America in terms of where the internet's going there. But China is very dominant in Africa. But India, the way India goes in terms of the internet and data governance, and they're doing a lot on data governance in India. It's because they're about to become 1.4 billion people. They're overtaking the size of China. And if you add China and India, and Africa, put them into the same collective, you've got more than half the world. And so the way that the rest of the world comes onto the internet is going to potentially determine the future of the internet and the future of data governance, and the future of AI. And I think it's very interesting to think of it from that global perspective, rather than always just a national perspective. And we have to understand in all this that our cultural values, our culture and our values can be very different. It's not all bad living in China. Right? we think it's all about surveillance, social credit. And you heard that lady in the film, and my friends in China, if it's, in some ways, if you don't mind not having free speech and you're happy with your government, which lots of Chinese people are, actually living in China with the internet as it is quite a good place to be. Now, I couldn't accept living. That's not what we're prepared to do. We have different sets of values, right? We have democratic values. We want freedom of speech, non-bias, non-discriminating. I think we have to think of this from a global as well as a national perspective. And so what I'm doing, I'm going to finish here. I could say a lot more, but we've got to think, we have to get our governments to think about how do we operate in this global space while getting what we want for in the national space, where our values are quite different. But globally, we are going to be exchanging services, systems, data, algorithms in that global space. And I think we would like everyone to have the rights to access to this global information system.
Well,
so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I finished. Go ahead, Judge.
No, I was going to say that I agree with you, but you ask if the future is already here. And I say, Gina, that a future is already here, or the current future is already here, because I don't believe that we are where we're going to be. I believe that there is still a lot more to achieve. And while I may not be able to conceive it, you folks can. So I believe that this is the current future, but I don't believe that it is the future. One of the things that concerns me, because as I tell you, I am, notwithstanding Dr. Sweeney mentioning her gray hair, I am old. And so I've been around a long time and I've seen the world evolve and I see where we are now. And it's just a marvel that over my lifetime, we have covered so much ground and we're now sitting and talking about things like AI. The concern that I have is that we will leave a considerable segment of the populace behind. You see, I am concerned about the future that all young people can envision and that they have access to designing that future. When I grew up, as I mentioned before, I grew up in the segregated South. Even though Brown versus the Board of Education had been decided, the state of Mississippi, where I'm from, paid no regard to that. And students of color went to schools that did not have the basic amenities. So there was no way that they could approach being equal. And so that prosperity was withheld from those students. And the teachers were marvelous. They did everything they could to make sure that we could compete, but we didn't have those basic resources. We actually had anvils around us because of government and circumstances. I know right now that there are efforts to make certain that girls and I think students of color have access to STEM programs, that they are introduced early and are able to participate in science and engineering and medicine and math. And I think that's wonderful. We cannot withhold the future from a certain segment of society and expect any country, let alone this country, to achieve its full potential. The future of a country has to be designed and envisioned by all of the people in that country. And we cannot afford to design and project a future where we leave a significant part of us parked on the sidelines. And I am heartened when I see people like Kimberly Bryant, a woman born in Memphis who founded Black Girls Code. I'm encouraged when I see students of color get involved in coding. And I was encouraged when I went to Islamabad, Pakistan, and met with young people who were amazing. They were brilliant, they were designing things, but because of governmental limitations, their future was somewhat circumscribed. But they were finding outlets even then to try and make certain that their talent, that their desire, that their ingenuity was recognized and was marketed to the world. And I do believe that at every point, we talk right now about the lack of diversity in tech. Well, we are the ones who can address that issue. There are bright people all over the place, but we've got to make certain that we are uncomfortable and that we do not become content with that absence of diversity in all those places where policy, where regulation, and where the future is being designed.
We have. It hasn't changed in 30 years. It's so hard. I want to change. I don't know if I don't know. Where people have said, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do to change diversity in tech? And I don't know what you do. You've got to change culture.
Well,
it's really hard. When I go to India, for example, as you said, in Pakistan, 50% of the class, the computer science class, will be women. It's not genetic.
Yeah. In Chennai, 60% I have seen.
Well, Middle East. All right, I'll raise you, Ricardo. If I go to the Middle East, I go into a classroom where there's 90% women. But the reasons are sometimes not what you want to hear. Because I asked one of the girls, "Where are all the men then?" "Oh, they're being educated in America."
Wow.
Well, I mean, I think recognizing that that it exists and making a commitment is maybe a small step, but it's a step. And if we don't speak it, it's been said that we speak our future, we speak our reality. So we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. We have got to speak it and address it and demand that we start. And part of that, I think, is in these schools giving putting the proper focus. When I watched the movie Picture of Scientists, I became very anxious and very disappointed and upset about some of the things that people are still having to face with. The fact that we are still either overtly or otherwise telling girls and children of color what they can't do. And I hear those stories over and over again. Mm-hmm. So there's got to be a countervailing voice. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be quiet now, Jeanna.
You've been wonderful.
I would like to compliment a few things that already were said, but for example, I think this the basic technology, usually you get the rich people get the good part, and the more vulnerable people get the bad part. And you see this all around the world. But for example, you mentioned social score. Yes, China is a very different regime, and many people don't like it, but they are very transparent about that. But in the US also you have a credit score, and other people have credit score. So at least in China, everyone has a social score. In the US, not all have a credit score. So in some sense, this is more fair. Also, credit score is correlated with wealth. So again, I think that will be less true in China. So in some sense, that's more fair too. So you have more fairness and transparency in the country that where you have less democracy, for example. I don't know. I am not an expert.
Ricardo, that is so the case. Also, if you look at India, that the population don't have an identity, so they can't. Their work on digital identity has been absolutely crucial, because if you haven't got an identity, you can't have a digital identity, so you can't get onto the internet and you can't use all these systems, let alone worry about whether they're biased or not. And the Aadhaar system in America and in India has given everybody access. The poorest people in villages farthest away from the center have access to the internet. It doesn't mean what's happening is fair, because it tends to not go to women for sure.
Yeah, also voting is a problem. Voting is a so voting is a problem, and also the US doesn't have a proper identity. So we use a driver's license for that, and at the end, like Latanya proved, you can infer from public data the identity of more than 80% of the people. So this privacy of not having an identity is an illusion, and that. But what I wanted to also to complement is that this transparency is also happens in other things, like this transparency versus accountability. You ask for transparency when you don't trust the system, and you ask for accountability when you trust the system. And that's the difference between Anglo-Saxon culture and the rest of the world. But for example, you see things that have been done with social networks in Myanmar or Philippines, and then even the people, all people know, nobody can do anything about that. So sometimes transparency is not enough, because you need to have the power to change things. And sadly, you only have it in a real democracy. And even countries that are examples of democracy, and I will not mention the countries, you see that justice doesn't work that well. And I'm sure Judge Donald already mentioned that. There are injustice in many countries, in the US, in Spain, in Chile, in all the places I see cases, judges are not the same. And then we have the noise of the decisions, which is something that's really important. I think we are losing more in the noise of the decision sometimes than in the bias of the decision.
You know, I don't think that there's one answer. There's no silver bullet. There's a lot of things. So when I remember very clearly in the earlier data privacy years, trying to explain this to Congress and elsewhere, and people felt more insulated because they could afford it. In other words, there was groups of people who said, well, you know, we could show how much more you knew about someone who needed social services than somebody who didn't need social services. And if you were rich enough, you didn't have to be in the health data that was shared, because you would just pay out of pocket. So therefore, you wouldn't be a part of that. But now today, you're in the data set whether you can pay out of pocket or not. Mm-hmm. And so that's a trajectory that's going. Another trajectory, though, that's hiding here is the one exposed in the pandemic. You know, sign up for a vaccine in the United States is on a web page. But there are lots of people who want a vaccine who don't have access to the internet. How are they supposed to sign up and get a vaccine? Right? Like, it's like a disconnect. And so there is this idea, when we think of policy and when we think of things, we do the same thing that the developers of these technologies do. They have a vision of who the user is. For a while there, it was pretty much young white guys who are early, and that's who they're designing for. And this begs the question then, on the last part of the trajectory, is what Wendy said, and that is, what happens when the companies began designing to bring the masses on? You know, which way will that cut? How is that technology going to work? Is it that there will be a bifurcation of technology, a different kind of technology for one group than any other? Because we've also seen this, there is this idea that if the person being disadvantaged or having the adverse impact is the other, then there's less care about it. But there is also this trajectory that the other becomes everyone over time because of the way the monies flow and the companies grow. So it is something that I warn us all about, to not just think about the other. And then the final piece that I was just going to add to is education continues to be critical to the upward mobility of all people. And it's just something that's incredibly important to do.
I have so many more things that I really would like to hear your thoughts on. And I am torn what to do with the last bit of our minutes together. Adam tells me that there's a couple slides I'm supposed to not forget to show everyone. So why don't we do that quickly so that I've done my duty that way. Adam, could you humor us there and share those? So we're going to have a recording of this session. There's more information at this tiny URL. Panelist information, policy statements, research books, films, more about ACM. Please keep this conversation going. Next slide, please. We'd also invite you to become a member of the ACM, to join us in working on these really important public policy and technology issues. This is not just for computer scientists. This is for all of us. Next slide, please. And we again want to thank all of our sponsors. And I will add in the Clarkson Open Source Institute, which was the first group who agreed to help sponsor all this set of things. Thank you, Adam, for showing those slides. So I know that Professor Sweeney and I believe Professor Hall may need to go right at the hour. So maybe we can start with them in this last one. So I was hoping we would get to what the heck can we do about it? You know, what do you see as the most promising technical work, public policy work? What do you focus on doing personally in your own work? What would you want to tell? If you could tell the audience members one thing that you wish they would do leaving here. And that is not to say there aren't fabulous ideas about what to do. If we had another bunch of hours, we could tell you about the exciting work that is going on, but that is not a silver bullet. We all need to pay attention. We all need the warning that we just heard from Professor Sweeney. We all need to be paying attention. And I will add one bit of a question in from the audience. You could choose to hit this one. You know, how do we get companies to comply? Fines don't exactly seem to be doing the trick. How do we bend them to our will? So I will let you take that wherever you would like to take it in our last minutes together. Professor Sweeney, can I start with you? Because I know you said you needed to leave at the hour.
Thank you. Well, you know, lots of us and many of the people who I see on the participants list and so forth have been noodling on these questions for a long time. There's a growing body of work in this space called public interest technology. This idea of how do we train technologists to work in the public interest, with a belief that if we teach them certain tool sets, that they would work in business, they'd work in government, in civil society, and sort of began to raise the bar. And I do have to do a Wendy and give a shout out. My upcoming book on this topic is In Technology We Trust. So where we try to lay out what those tools might be, how that vision might happen. There's, outside of that trajectory, there is this idea of ethics. I think the ethics is limited in how far it can go in solving these problems, but the commitment of the community to it has been incredibly important, because it begins to say, so for example, this panel only exists because somebody else cared to say, oh, wait a second, ACM needs to revisit its code of ethics. We need to think about and begin taking responsibility. And that created a trajectory that led us to this panel. This panel will be the stepping stone for more. So this constant ongoing questioning of ourselves, and we're both on the inside, we question the technology, but also holding the technology accountable. And there might be different ways to doing that. I'll stop there because I want to hear what others have to say as well before I have to leave.
Dr. Hall?
Well, there is, as Latanya said, there is no silver bullet here. I think what we're doing here is one of the most important things. And I was deeply honored to be asked to be on this panel, especially to meet the judge, but also to meet, I have a friend, a female judge who knows you. I've been emailing her while we've been online, and I'm the same age as you. We are the same age.
Oh, wow, okay. A connection here.
So, and when you were, you know, I was, you know, in the 60s feminism, right? And you're in the South, and, you know, I've lived inequality, right? And I've been lucky in my career to get where I am, and privileged. That sounds awfully humble. I'm not trying to, you know, but I think this awareness raising, Latanya said education, yes. and it's so important that we see this both locally, nationally, and internationally, right? I think because it is, in this world, this AI world is not going to be one where just our own culture, our own country is going to be able to rule the roost or make everything happen the way we want it to happen. We have to accept that this is we have to set these ideas about fairness and regulation in a global context, and looking what's happening on the technology in a global context. So awareness raising and doing this sort of thing, which is why I jumped at it. I wasn't just honored. Thank you to Lorraine and Jeanna for organizing it, and Adam, of course, who's there. Because the more we can do of this and raise awareness, in that film we've all watched, Coded Bias, you know, those sorts of things really bring attention. I mean, I love the things like Hidden Figures, the picture of scientists, you know, these raise the awareness at levels that everybody can understand. Your policymaker, your parent, the person in the street looking at the fact that their picture is big, taken by the police van. You know, we have to understand that's the world we live in. And there's this issue, and I think COVID, this is my last comment, COVID has really, the pandemic has really brought this out in our societies, and by that I mean the Western democracies, as we like to call ourselves. Seeing in COVID, I mean, I've been in lockdown. We talk about civil liberties. I've not been out of my house for a year, right? I've lost my liberty. Now, that's for the good of the whole, right? We've accepted these things, and the vaccination program. You know, you've got to accept these things. The people who don't, for the good of the whole, the community, and we have to set. It's a bit like the same like climate change. We've got to think about this from outside ourselves, I think, is the point I'm trying to make here, and accept that maybe there's a balance between civil liberties and national security at times that, you know, we somehow have to accept, but we've also got to fight to keep the liberties that our ancestors fought for us. So, sorry, I've rambled a bit, but more of this, I think, is my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall. Professor Baeza-Yates?
Yes, I will insist on awareness. I think that the first thing I would recommend is that you learn about your own biases, and you need to have the will for that. You will learn more than you think, because one of the things that the first thing you think is like, I'm not biased, right? You have a bias to that, and you can learn to detect bias in yourself and other people, and then you need to make aware other people of that. So this education starts with awareness. And it would be great to have more leaders like Macron and others that really worry about this problem. And Biden, I know it is. So there were many tries to do new legislation in the US about this, and didn't happen. And this, I agree with Latanya that ethics doesn't solve everything, but if you are aware of ethics, at least you will start. For example, when I saw the news about this pilot in London where people were doing facial recognition, police was doing facial recognition in one poor neighborhood of the city, I said, well, but this is not ethical right away, but it still happened, and many people had to complain for several months, and you see that in the movie, to get rid of this pilot. Would you think, okay, UK is one of the top democracies in the world, but they are doing that. So this, I think, if the top countries, in whatever sense you want to use top, don't give the examples, we are in a hard position to ask other countries to do it.
Thank you so much. Judge Donald, you opened us up with a reminder of how this affects us all. I would love to give you the last word on this panel, and thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you. I will take it, and it's been my pleasure. I want to remind everyone that Dr. King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But I want to share with you today, it doesn't just bend of its own volition. It doesn't just bend of its own gravitational force. It bends because those of us, people of goodwill, apply our hands to pull or push the arc in the direction of justice. And this arc of technology, we need to push and pull in the direction of justice. What I would encourage people to do today is to get outside of your own tent. You're all smart, you know technology, you hold the future in your brains, in your hands. Share that future, ignite the dreams of other people with that knowledge that you have. All across this country, there are young children who cannot right now imagine a life beyond their circumstances, but you have the power to enlarge their dreams. You have the power to point them in a direction where they can have the tools to help design that future that I have encouraged them to live in. But if you don't do that, if you simply stay within your circle of expertise, how then will their life ever be ignited that they might join in designing that future? What I would say to you today, do not project, and I say that to me also, do not project our own biases onto future generations. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I visited a school in Chicago. It was a school set up by a lawyer for underprivileged children. And I sat in the back of the class, and there was a young African-American child in that room who had his head down on his desk. He appeared to be totally disengaged, totally, to my mind, not interested. And I projected my biases about his capabilities onto him, even though I knew nothing about him. At some point, the teacher laid out some, to me, incredibly long math problem on the board and called on this child to solve it. He raised up out of his chair. He didn't put pen to paper. He simply went through the process and gave the answer. The professor said, "Tell the class how you did that." And he went through again. He walked to the board, and the whole problem took up 2 boards. Now I'm sitting back there. I have no idea. If my life had depended on me solving that, I would have been dead today. But that child whom I had said is not interested, fully understood that. All around the world, we are suppressing futures by projecting our own biases onto those students. Dr. Sweeney said that education is the key. I would challenge you to go out in your community and introduce what you know to people that you think may not be interested. I will tell you, they will surprise you every time, and they're going to surpass your expectations. We have the power to ignite the future. Let's do it.
Thank you. What a wonderful place to leave us all. We're at 4:06, and I'm deeply grateful and honored to have had all of your heartfelt participation today. Thank you so much. There's so much else we could say, and there's so much work going on in this space. I would invite you to reach out and join us in pulling the arc of technology towards a just future, a future that can support healthy human well-being, healthy societies, democratic principles, human rights. It will not happen automatically. We need all of you to help us. Please engage with us. Please engage with each other. We have a rich set of links we can point you towards, and I'm sure you have others. Please send them to us. We need to work together. It will not happen automatically. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.